The poor heiress helped a broken billionaire on the day he had nothing left to lose, but what he would later do in return would change her destiny forever. She was the last surviving heir of a fallen fortune, living quietly, invisibly, carrying a powerful last name that no longer protected her. He was a billionaire in name only, stripped of family, purpose, and the will to stand, collapsing in public while the world walked past him. She knelt beside him, not knowing who he truly was, not knowing that his rise had once destroyed everything she inherited. He looked at her, not knowing who she truly was, unaware that the kindness saving his life belonged to the very heiress his empire had broken. She helped him because she was kind but poor. He accepted her help because he was wealthy but completely broken. And in that single moment of mercy, a debt was born, one that money alone could not repay. But who was the poor heiress before she lost everything? Why was the billionaire so broken after having it all? And when the truth finally surfaced, would his return of kindness heal her destiny, or destroy them both forever? Clara Whitmore's knees pressed against the cold concrete of the train platform as she reached for the stranger's wrist. Around them, the afternoon crowd thinned and flowed, shoes clicking past with practiced indifference. Someone slowed, glanced, then turned away. Another muttered, "Someone else will help." Someone else always did, until they didn't. "There's a pulse," Clara said, her voice steadier than her hands. She had learned early that panic solved nothing. Her father used to say that calm was a kind of wealth one no one could steal if you guarded it well. The man's suit was expensive, tailored in a way that suggested old money rather than flashy success, but it hung on him now like a discarded identity. His watch, platinum, unmistakably rare, was shattered. The glass cracked as if time itself had struck him and won. His hair was streaked faintly with gray, not from age but from exhaustion that had settled too deep to hide. "Sir," she said softly, "can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open. They were sharp, intelligent, and completely empty. The look startled her more than the collapse itself. This was not the gaze of a drunk or a sick man. It was the look of someone who had already fallen long before his body followed. "Don't," he whispered as paramedics pushed through the crowd. His fingers caught her sleeve with surprising strength. "Don't leave. I'm right here," Clara said, without thinking. The words came easily, as if they had been waiting for her to say them all her life. At the hospital, she stayed long after she should have gone. She told herself it was because she wanted to make sure he survived. She did not tell herself that something about him felt unfinished, like a story interrupted mid-sentence. When a nurse asked, "Are you family?" Clara hesitated. "No," she said. "Just someone who helped." She noticed the coat folded neatly over a chair. Inside the lining, stitched small and discreet, was a name, E. Blackwell. The name struck something deep and old. Clara's chest tightened. She touched the locket at her throat without realizing it, the thin gold warm against her skin. Inside it rested a fragment of her past, one she never opened in public, one her father had hidden away with trembling hands, and a warning she hadn't understood until years later. The man stirred again, his voice hoarse. "Why?" he asked, eyes finding hers. "Why did you stop?" Clara thought of eviction notices, of working 2 jobs despite graduating with honors, of a childhood home sold under legal terms she had never been allowed to question, of a last name that once opened doors and now closed them. "Because someone should," she said. Outside the room, a doctor spoke quietly into a phone about emotional collapse, severe burnout, no substances involved. A billionaire who had lost everything that mattered but couldn't name what it was. Clara didn't hear that. She sat there, unaware that the man breathing unevenly before her was Ethan Blackwell, the architect of a corporate takeover that had crushed Whitmore Holdings, the man whose signature had appeared on documents signed the week her father collapsed in court. And Ethan Blackwell, drifting in and out of consciousness, didn't know that the woman holding his hand was Clara Whitmore, the poor heiress to a fortune he once claimed, now returned to him in the form of undeserved kindness. Neither of them understood it yet, but fate had already recognized its debt. Clara left the hospital just before midnight. The automatic door sighing closed behind her as if reluctant to let the day end. The city air was cool, smelling faintly of metal and rain that hadn't fallen yet. She stood there for a moment, fingers curled around the strap of her bag, replaying the way the man's hand had tightened around hers when he thought she might leave. "Don't leave." The words stayed with her all the way home. Her rented room above the old bookstore was narrow and clean, furnished with discipline rather than comfort. A single bed, a desk stacked with legal files she was paid to organize but never allowed to comment on. On the wall hung one framed photograph turned face down. She hadn't looked at it in years, yet she knew every detail of it by heart. She loosened her coat and caught her reflection in the mirror. Plain clothes, tired eyes, posture to compose for someone with so little. That contradiction followed her everywhere. Even her cafe manager once joked, "You walk like you're guarding something valuable." Clara had smiled then, but said nothing. She opened the locket at last. Inside was the folded fragment of an old share certificate. Edges soft from years of being hidden, moved, protected. Her father's handwriting was faint along the margin, a reminder written the night before his final court appearance. Not instructions, a plea. Trust patience. Truth survives longer than power. The memory came uninvited. Her father kneeling to her height, his suit rumpled, eyes bloodshot but gentle. He had pressed the locket into her palm as though it were something alive. "No matter what they say tomorrow," he told her, voice steady in a way adults use when lying to children, "your name still means something." The next day, the company board voted against him. The week after, he collapsed in the courthouse hallway. By the end of the month, Whitmore Holdings no longer existed. Clara snapped the locket shut, breath tight. She told herself she didn't care anymore. That was the rule she lived by now. Caring was expensive. At the hospital the next morning, Ethan Blackwell woke to silence so complete it rang. The machines hummed, indifferent. His body felt heavier than it should have, as if guilt had mass. A doctor stood at the foot of the bed. "You're lucky someone stopped," he said. "Another 10 minutes and we'd be having a very different conversation." Ethan turned his head slowly. "Did she? The woman, did she leave?" "She asked about you twice before she went," the doctor replied. "Didn't leave a name." Ethan stared at the ceiling. A name burned behind his eyes anyway. Whitmore. He didn't know why it surfaced now. Only that it came with the phantom sensation of a boardroom table. A raised hand, a vote cast without looking back. Later, when a nurse brought his belongings, he noticed his watch first. Cracked. Useless. He should have felt angry. Instead, he felt exposed. When Clara returned that afternoon, carrying a paper cup of coffee she couldn't afford to waste, Ethan looked at her as if afraid she might vanish if he blinked. "You came back," he said. "You're not discharged yet," she replied lightly. "Someone should check." The words echoed her own from the day before, and something in Ethan's chest shifted, small, but dangerous. For the first time in years, someone was near him without wanting anything. Neither of them noticed the way the nurse paused when she heard the name. Blackwell. Neither of them saw how close they were to a truth that would rearrange everything they believed about kindness, guilt, and debt. Ethan's recovery was slow, not because his body resisted healing, but because his mind kept dragging him backward. Clara noticed it in the way his gaze lingered on nothing, in how his hands clenched whenever paperwork appeared at the edge of his vision. He reacted to forms the way other people reacted to weapons. "Do you want me to read that to you?" she asked one afternoon, gesturing toward a consent document resting untouched on the tray. He shook his head too quickly. "No. I'll do it." But he didn't. Minutes passed. The pen stayed where it was. Clara didn't push. She had learned long ago that silence could be kinder than questions. Instead, she adjusted the window blinds, letting in softer light. Her movements were efficient, practiced, the kind that came from years of adapting to spaces that were never truly hers. "You don't talk much about what you do," she said eventually. Ethan let out a dry laugh. "I used to. People paid me to talk. Now I don't know what I'd say." She tilted her head. "You could start with your name, Ethan," he replied, after a pause. Then, quieter, Blackwell. The name landed between them. Clara's fingers stilled for half a second before continuing their motion. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it came from a place trained to recognize danger early. She had seen that name once before on court documents she was never meant to read, stamped with authority and finality. She didn't connect it fully yet, but something inside her folded inward, protective. "My father used to say names outlive people," she said carefully. "They carry things forward." Ethan swallowed. He looked at her as if he wanted to ask something but didn't trust himself to hear the answer. That night, after she left, the dreams returned. He was back in the boardroom, glass walls glowing with city light. Men and women in tailored suits spoke in polished phrases about fiduciary duty and shareholder value. James Whitmore stood at the far end of the table, hands flat, voice calm but eyes burning. "This isn't business," Whitmore said. "It's erasure." Ethan, younger then, sharper, didn't respond. He only lifted his hand and voted. The dream always ended the same way, with the sound of a body hitting marble, with the taste of metal in Ethan's mouth as he turned away. He woke gasping, monitors beeping in protest. When Clara returned the next day, she found him sitting upright, jacket folded neatly on his lap. "I owe you an apology," he said before she could speak. "For what?" "For dragging you into something you didn't ask for." His gaze flicked to her hands, to the faint indentation where a ring used to be or maybe never was. "You shouldn't feel responsible for me." Clara smiled faintly. "I'm not responsible. I chose." The word choice resonated deeper than she knew. Her entire life had been shaped by decisions made without her consent. Helping him was one of the few things that had been hers alone. A nurse interrupted with discharge instructions. Ethan listened this time. He asked questions. He signed where needed. As they walked toward the exit together, Ethan hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" She nodded. Double quotes. "Why did you really stop that day?" Clara didn't answer immediately. Instead, her hand brushed the locket beneath her coat. A gesture so habitual she no longer noticed it. "Because," she said finally, "I know what it feels like when the world decides you're expendable." Ethan closed his eyes. He didn't know yet that the world had made that decision for her, because of him. And Clara didn't yet know that the man walking beside her carried the key to a door she had spent years pretending didn't exist. Ethan insisted on walking her part of the way, though his steps were measured, cautious, as if he didn't yet trust his own body to obey him. The city moved around them in practiced indifference, traffic lights blinking, vendors calling out, people laughing into phones. Life, uninterrupted. "You don't live far?" he asked. "Far enough," Clara replied. She had learned to keep answers elastic. Precise truth invited questions, and questions invited histories she preferred undisturbed. They stopped at the corner where her bus arrived every 20 minutes, like clockwork. She checked her watch. Cheap, reliable, unremarkable. Ethan noticed it. The way it didn't match her posture, her diction, the quiet authority in her presence. "You weren't raised the way you live now," he said. Not as an accusation, but an observation. Clara's lips curved faintly. "People say that a lot. They're usually wrong," Ethan said. "But not this time." The bus approached, brakes hissing. Clara hesitated, then turned back to him. "You should go home," she said. "Rest." He nodded, then surprised himself by asking, "Will I see you again?" The question felt heavier than it should have. Clara considered the many reasons she shouldn't say yes. Then she remembered her father's voice, low and firm, reminding her that fear often dressed itself as wisdom. "If you're still recovering," she said, "I can check in." Ethan exhaled slowly, as if something he hadn't known he was holding finally loosened. "I'd like that." That night, alone in his penthouse for the first time in weeks, Ethan walked through rooms that no longer felt like shelter. Art he'd acquired to signal taste rather than love stared back at him. The silence was absolute. He poured a drink, then set it down untouched. On the kitchen counter lay an envelope he hadn't opened in months. Inside were documents he knew by heart, old acquisition files, legal confirmations, signatures stacked neatly like gravestones. Whitmore Holdings. He stared at the name until his chest tightened. The coincidence was too sharp now, too persistent. Clara's last name hadn't escaped him earlier. He told himself it meant nothing. People shared names all the time, but not like that. Not with her eyes. Across the city, Clara climbed the narrow stairs to her room, muscles aching from the day. She unlocked the door, paused, then turned the picture-framed face up at last. The photograph showed a younger Clara between her parents, standing in front of a glass building bearing the Whitmore name. Her father's hand rested on her shoulder, protective and proud. Her mother smiled with the confidence Clara had spent years trying to remember how to wear. She sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the image longer than usual. Blackwell. The name surfaced again, this time with sharper edges. She rose and opened a battered file box beneath her desk. Inside were photocopies she wasn't supposed to have, gathered slowly, carefully, over years. Corporate filings, trustee transfers. One signature appeared again and again at the bottom of decisive pages. E. Blackwell. Her breath caught not in anger, but in something colder. Understanding without context was dangerous. She closed the box and locked it away. Later, lying awake, she wondered if the man she had helped was connected or if this was just her past reaching for her through coincidence. Across the city, Ethan stood at his window, staring down at lights that once bowed to him. Neither slept, because somewhere between kindness and consequence, the truth was beginning to surface. They met again 3 days later at a quiet cafe tucked between a florist and a closed tailor shop, the kind of place that survived on regulars and patience rather than profit. Clara chose it deliberately. Neutral ground. No history attached. Ethan arrived early. He always had. Even now, stripped of his former authority, habits clung to him like muscle memory. He stood when he saw her, then caught himself, half embarrassed. "You didn't have to," Clara said, gesturing for him to sit. "I wanted to," he replied. It felt right. She ordered tea. He ordered nothing at first, then coffee, then changed his mind back to nothing. Clara noticed. Control was something he had once wielded effortlessly. Now it slipped through his fingers in small, telling ways. "You look better," she said. He gave a short smile. "That depends on the comparison." They spoke of ordinary things at first. The weather, the train delays, a book she was reading for work. It would have been easy to mistake them for strangers sharing polite company, if not for the weight under every word. After a pause, Ethan said quietly, "I used to believe success fixed everything." Clara didn't respond immediately. She waited. People often revealed more when they weren't rushed. "I thought if I won enough," he continued, eyes fixed on the table, the noise would stop. The doubts, the resentment, his jaw tightened. It didn't. Clara thought of her father again, not the powerful executive the world saw, but the man who came home late, loosened his tie, and still asked about her day as if it mattered more than markets. "My father used to say power shows who you really are," she said softly. "Not who you pretend to be." Ethan looked up sharply. "What did he do?" "He protected what he built," Clara replied. "Even when it cost him." The words hung between them, heavy with implication neither acknowledged out loud. Ethan felt it anyway, like a distant tremor warning of an earthquake yet to come. He reached into his coat and withdrew his wallet to pay when the bill arrived. As he opened it, something slipped free and landed on the table, a worn photograph. Creased at the edges, Clara's breath caught. The image showed a younger Ethan standing beside a man she recognized instantly. James Whitmore, alive, smiling politely, though his eyes were guarded. The photo had been taken at a charity gala years ago, before everything fractured. Ethan froze. This shouldn't." Clara's fingers hovered just above the photograph, not touching. She didn't need to. The connection snapped into place with a clarity that made her chest ache. "That's my father," she said quietly. The cafe noise seemed to dull around them, as if the world itself leaned back to watch. Ethan swallowed hard. His voice came out strained. "Whitmore?" "Yes." The silence that followed was not empty. It was crowded with years of consequence, with choices made and lives redirected. Ethan finally leaned back, face pale. "I didn't know," he said. The words sounded weak even to him. "If I had..." Clara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, her expression was controlled and readable. "Most people who hurt us don't know," she said. "That doesn't change what happens after." Neither of them spoke again for a long moment. Outside, a delivery truck passed, its engine rumbling like distant thunder. Something had shifted irreversibly, and both of them understood that whatever came next would demand more than apologies, more than kindness. It would demand truth. They didn't leave the cafe together. Clara stood first, smoothing her coat with deliberate calm, the same calm she had learned to wear to court hearings she was never allowed to speak in. "I need time," she said, not as a request, but a boundary. "So do you." Ethan nodded, shame sitting heavily in his chest. "I'll be here," he replied, then corrected himself. "I won't disappear." She paused, as if weighing whether to believe him, then turned and walked away. That night, Ethan returned to the documents he had avoided for years. Not the summaries his lawyers once prepared, but the raw filings, the ones that carried fingerprints rather than polish. He read until his eyes burned. He followed the trail of signatures, trustee transfers, emergency clauses triggered at precisely the right moment. The acquisition had been legal. But it hadn't been clean. He remembered the meeting he'd forgotten on purpose. A junior analyst hesitating before speaking, warning that Whitmore Holdings' protective trusts would collapse if a certain clause were activated during litigation. Ethan had approved it anyway. Proceed, he'd said back then, impatient. "Time is leverage." Across the city, Clara sat on her bed, the file box open at last. She spread the papers across the blanket in neat rows, a ritual she had repeated whenever the past threatened to blur. Each page told a piece of the same story: a company stripped, an estate frozen, a teenage heir quietly written out of relevance. Her father's final days returned to her with painful clarity. The hospital room, the machines, the way he squeezed her hand and whispered, "They want you to be small. Don't." She hadn't been small. She'd survived. But survival wasn't justice. The next morning, Ethan requested a meeting with his former legal counsel. The receptionist hesitated, then transferred the call. Power lingered around him like an old ghost, still recognized even when unwelcome. I need the Whitmore files reopened. He said. There was a pause. Those matters are settled. Then unsettle them, Ethan replied. I want every trustee, every emergency vote, every clause reviewed. Quietly. And why? The lawyer asked carefully. Would you want to do that now? Ethan looked out at the city, remembering the way Clara had knelt beside him without knowing who he was. Because, he said, I finally know what it cost. When Clara returned to work that afternoon, her supervisor slid a new folder onto her desk. Unusual request, he said. Someone wants historical verification on dormant trusts. High priority. She opened the file. Whitmore. Her pulse quickened, but her hand stayed steady. Years of waiting had taught her restraint. Later that evening, Ethan sent a single message. No explanations. No defenses. I'm looking into it. All of it. You deserve the truth, whether you ever speak to me again or not. Clara stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Truth doesn't undo harm, she typed. Then, after a pause, added, but it tells us what we're really dealing with. She set the phone aside. Unsure whether she was bracing for hope or disappointment. Because beneath the anger, beneath the hurt she refused to show, there was something far more dangerous. Expectation. The truth did not arrive all at once. It surfaced the way buried things often do, piece by piece, sharp-edged, impossible to ignore once exposed. Clara found the first fracture buried in a trust amendment dated 2 weeks before her father's collapse. The language was precise, almost elegant, but its effect was brutal. A safeguard designed to protect her inheritance had been rerouted, temporarily transferred under the justification of corporate stability. Temporary, in legal language, could mean forever. She leaned back in her chair, eyes closing briefly. The office around her hummed with ordinary life, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, but she felt suspended between then and now. She remembered her father coming home late that night, shoulders heavy, sitting at the kitchen table long after dinner had gone cold. They're moving faster than I expected, he'd said quietly, more to himself than to her. If anything happens to me, she had cut him off then, angry at the implication. He'd smiled faintly, as if he already knew how that conversation would end. Now, Clara saw it clearly. He hadn't been preparing for failure. He'd been preparing for theft. Across town, Ethan read the same amendment with growing horror. The junior analyst's warning replayed in his mind, no longer muffled by success. He saw how the trustees he'd trusted had acted with opportunistic precision, exploiting his urgency, his need to win. He had authorized the pressure. They had executed the damage. The distinction felt meaningless now. Ethan requested a private audit, invoking clauses that allowed founder review privileges he had never used, assuming his empire immune to moral decay. The results were worse than he feared. Accounts frozen without notice. Proxy votes cast under emergency authority that had no emergency at all. Whitmore Holdings hadn't collapsed. It had been dismantled. When Clara and Ethan finally spoke again, it was in a conference room neither of them had chosen for comfort. Glass walls, neutral lighting, a place built for truths that didn't care about feelings. I didn't know they went that far, Ethan said, voice low. But I gave them the power to do it. Clara nodded slowly. My father knew, she replied. He just couldn't stop it. Silence stretched, dense but controlled. No accusations. No absolution. Ethan slid a document across the table. These trusts were never dissolved, he said. They were suspended. With the right authority, they can be restored. Clara looked at the paper, then at him. Authority you still have, yes. And you're offering it. Why? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Ethan met her gaze. Because what I took wasn't just a company, he said. It was a future. For the first time since they'd met, Clara's composure cracked. Not into tears, but into something far more revealing, raw, trembling honesty. You don't get to give that back like a favor, she said quietly. I know, Ethan replied. That's why I'm not giving it back as me. He stood, pushing the chair away. I'm stepping aside. The words hung heavy, charged. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You did that. I already have, Ethan said. The board just doesn't know yet. In that moment, Clara understood that this wasn't restitution. It was surrender. And surrender, she realized, Was something money couldn't fake. The announcement didn't come with fireworks. It arrived the way real change often did, through silence, signatures, and rooms where decisions were made before anyone else heard about them. Ethan resigned effective immediately. No press tour, no farewell interview, just a carefully worded notice to the board and a transfer of voting authority that shifted power without spectacle. Markets reacted later. Speculation followed. But by then, it was already done. Clara learned of it not from the news, but from a sealed envelope waiting on her desk when she arrived at work. Inside were certified documents bearing her name, full, unabridged, unmistakable. Clara Whitmore, beneficiary, trustee, chair waiting. Her breath caught, sharp and unsteady. She closed the office door and sat slowly, grounding herself the way her father had taught her when panic threatened to turn clarity into chaos. She read every page twice, then a third time. The logic held. The restoration wasn't symbolic. It was complete. The door opened softly. Her supervisor stood there, pale. "There's someone asking for you." Very insistent. Clara nodded once. "Send them in." The boardroom felt different when she entered it, not because it had changed, but because she had. The long table no longer intimidated her. It felt familiar, like a place she had been trained for long before she understood why. Ethan stood at the far end, hands empty, posture unguarded. "I won't stay," he said before she could speak. "I just wanted you to hear it from me." "You gave up everything," Clara replied. "It wasn't a question. I gave back what wasn't mine to keep," he said. She studied him, searching for calculation, for pride disguised as remorse. She found none. What she saw instead was exhaustion, honest, unvarnished. "My father believed institutions outlived people," Clara said slowly. "But only if people inside them chose integrity over convenience." Ethan nodded. "He was right," she exhaled, a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for years. "Then I'll finish what he started." He smiled faintly. "I expected nothing less." When Ethan left the building, no one stopped him. No one recognized him without the weight of his former authority. He stepped into the street lighter, though poorer by any measure that once mattered to him. Inside, Clara remained. Later that evening, alone in the boardroom, she opened her locket one final time. She placed the share certificate fragment on the table beside the restored documents, aligning past and present until they fit. She whispered, "We're back, not for revenge, for legacy." Power returned to Clara more gently than she had imagined. There were no trumpets, no triumphant speeches, just long days filled with careful decisions, meetings that demanded patience instead of force, and nights when she went home exhausted but clear-headed. The board watched her closely at first, measuring her against Ghost's, her father's legacy, Ethan's former authority, but Clara did not try to imitate either. She listened. That, more than anything, unsettled them. She asked questions no one had asked in years. About employees quietly dismissed during the acquisition. About community projects abandoned when they stopped being profitable. About clauses written to protect people rather than margins. One executive finally said, "This isn't how Blackwell ran things." Clara met his gaze evenly. "That's the point." Across the city, Ethan learned what it meant to exist without command. He moved into a smaller apartment overlooking a park instead of the skyline. He walked instead of being driven. People passed him without recognition, and at first, the anonymity felt like punishment. Then it felt like relief. He followed the company's restructuring from a distance, reading reports he no longer controlled. He noticed things he had once dismissed as insignificant: employee retention rising, lawsuits quietly withdrawn, communities reinvested in. One evening, he found himself standing outside the old bookstore Clara had once mentioned, now reopened with a new sign in the window. He didn't go in. He didn't need to. The knowledge that it existed again was enough. Weeks passed before they spoke. When they did, it was over coffee. Different cafe. Same quiet tone. "You look lighter," Clara observed. "So do you," Ethan replied. "I am," she said. "Not because I have things back. Because I don't have to fight the truth anymore." He nodded. "I spent years believing winning was the same as being right. And now I know the difference." They sat in companionable silence, not as debtor and benefactor, not as victim and cause, but as two people who had survived the same storm from opposite sides. Before they parted, Ethan hesitated. "There's something I never said." Clara waited. "Thank you," he said simply. "Not for forgiving me. For stopping." She considered that, then smiled faintly. "Kindness doesn't erase consequences," she replied. but it does decide what grows after. As she walked away, Ethan watched her disappear into the crowd, not invisible this time, but unmistakably present. And for the first time, he felt certain that what he had given her in return for her kindness was not just her destiny restored, but his own, finally rewritten. The day Clara took her father's name back into the light, the city barely noticed. There was no press release announcing Whitmore Holdings' return to independent control. No headline declaring the fall of a former titan, or the rise of a forgotten heiress. The world kept moving, unaware that something long broken had finally been set right. Clara stood alone in her office as evening softened the glass walls around her. The building no longer bore her name on the outside, but it didn't need to. Power, she had learned, didn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waited, patient and precise. She placed her father's photograph on the shelf behind her desk, not as decoration, but as grounding. The man in the picture smiled the same way he had on the day he told her the truth mattered more than timing. You were right, she said softly, though no one else was there to hear it. It survived. Across the city, Ethan walked through the park as dusk settled, hands in his pockets, steps unhurried. Children laughed nearby. A dog tugged impatiently at its leash. Ordinary sounds, once invisible to him, now felt like proof of life. He paused at a bench, sitting where months earlier he might have stood impatiently checking his phone. He thought of the platform where everything had changed, not because he fell, but because someone stopped. He had lost wealth, status, and control. But in return, he had gained something rarer, alignment. Clara and Ethan met one last time weeks later, not by appointment, but by chance or whatever replaced coincidence once choices took over. You look well, he said. So do you, she replied. They shared a quiet smile. No promises, no debts left unpaid. As they parted, Clara touched the locket at her throat, feeling its familiar weight, not heavy now, but balanced. Inside it rested not just proof of inheritance, but the memory of who she had chosen to be when it mattered most. And Ethan, watching her go, understood something that had eluded him his entire life. Kindness, when returned with truth, does more than change a future. It redeems the past. Because the poor heiress did not just help a broken billionaire. She helped him become whole. And in doing so, he returned to her the destiny that had always been hers. Forever.